Hello and welcome to the Teaching Transformations podcast, a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christchurch University. I'm your host, Jack Swan. In this podcast, we interview lecturers and course leaders and ask them how they've managed to embed sustainability into their course and their teaching. Dr. Dave Hitchcock is reader in early modern British history and a historian of poverty and homelessness. He's currently the course director of the History Subject Suite and leader of the History and Archeology Research Unit. His teaching focuses on the broad social and cultural contours of early modern Europe, Atlantic colonialism, and social problems in England circa 1600 to 1800. His research looks at vagrancy and poverty in early modern England and in the British Atlantic world. He's presently in the early stages of a new book, tentatively called The Ends of Poverty, circa 1600 to 1800, intending to cover material ranging from utopian imaginings to colonial displacement and architectural and environmental design. With such a broad field of research, I was really keen to begin by asking Dave how he connects history with these themes of sustainability. Okay, so Dave, can you tell us some ways of how sustainability is weaved throughout the history curriculum?
Sure, and thanks very much for having me here to talk about these things today. History is a big subject. Technically speaking, any time since writing was sort of first invented in the ancient distant past, all the way through to histories of present day is possibly our terrain. And so the ways it feeds into our curriculum here at Christchurch are distributed. We don't have a single module that is set aside to purely do sustainability work. We tend to teach it either when we're talking about environmental sustainability or about issues of social justice, distributed throughout the entire curriculum across all 3 years. So in many ways, it's about picking highlights and looking at those. For instance, we have a colleague who specializes in ancient Roman history, who teaches on our first year, who is very interested in questions of water use. That's his area of research. And so when he is leading students in that initial introductory work that they do with him at level 4, he will pivot to the things he knows best, the ways Romans use water, and actually he's interested in food production as well, and he teaches from that perspective. And it's a very different point of view, right? It has little obvious bearing on our modern, heavily industrialized or post-industrial society, but it does show students the intricate relationship between the natural world and the built world, between the kind of the ground that we grow our food in and the ways that we live on it. So that's a highlight. We also embed it much more practically in our second year, where most of our students, and from next year all of our students, do a module called Applied Humanities, which we created. And that's essentially a placement module. So it's not just placements related to sustainability, but we have a wide range of heritage projects, research projects. In previous interviews, some of your interviewees might have talked about what's called green heritage. So ensuring that when one preserves a heritage property or redesigns it or updates it or even presents it to the public, that one does that in a sustainable way. So we've had a lot of students in past years do that work quite practically in Kent on various projects. So for instance, you can go out behind some of the buildings on our campus and find these little climate dragons. I don't know if you've seen these. Those sort of originated in the history program. It was a researcher called Diane Heath who did a big funded project on medieval animals, both real and fictional. And as part of that, teaching green heritage to a wider public, she set up this idea that we should sort of build up dragon figures out of sort of plants and rocks and soil and make them sustainable and sort of self-perpetuating. Many history students have helped with that. So there are a whole range of other ways that we teach it. At upper year, we might teach histories of the environment more directly. We might talk about landscape. We might talk about the politics of environmentalism, particularly in modern history classes. Anything from the sort of 1960s onwards, we can start to talk about Silent Spring and the effects of global environmental consciousness on the voting public, the reading public, the television watching public. We might teach it from a very different perspective entirely. We might talk about space and the very famous photograph Blue Marble, right, which is widely credited with reconfiguring how the public sort of started to view the planet a little bit less as an infinite resource and a bit more as a sort of spaceship Earth, right, that we sort of have to take care of. So there's any number of possible ways to answer the first question.
Within
that's just some of them.
Your practice then, the modules that you're leading on, you're teaching on, what are the things that you're most excited about doing?
So to answer that one, I'm what's called an early modernist. I specialize in the history of this country about 300 years ago. In addition to that, I teach what's called transatlantic history. So I touch on pretty difficult topics like the transatlantic slave trade, the American and French revolutions, imperialism and colonialism, and so on. There are any number of intersections between those processes and what we see around us in terms of the uses of the natural world and of sort of its resources today. So I have a particular interest in what I call terraforming, which is a science fiction term. So the idea that a society chooses to radically alter a physical space to suit its needs or to sort of improve the society it wants to put there. Terraforming is a colonial term, right? When we talk about visiting other planets to kind of colonize them, which is much harder than it sounds, by the way, we talk as if we will terraform those planets so that they're habitable for us. Well, we've, as a species, done that before, quite a lot, right? The North America that I come from is very different than the North America that Europeans encountered 400 years ago. So I teach that. I'm also a specialist in the history of poverty. So I have quite a lot to say about that particular angle on sustainability, which is to say that we will never solve it as a sort of global question unless we take seriously the unequal basis on which it's occurring. In other words, the poor are the most affected set of populations right now when it comes to questions of climate crisis. They will be into the future the most affected populations. And so I have a lot to say about that too, and I do some teaching on that.
What I'm quite keen to explore is the way you're describing the overall history curriculum and the many, many different schemes of work embedded in that is perhaps compared to some other courses, you have a lot of flexibility to explore these themes, whereas some of the other lecturers that we've been speaking to throughout this process have had to hold teaching sustainability in tension with validatory criteria and so forth. For you, although you have that flexibility, have you ever encountered any challenges of how to embed these themes, either from a teaching practice or from a sort of skills outcome kind of practice?
Yeah, I think we have. I wouldn't describe those challenges as insurmountable or particularly sort of difficult, but they are real. First and foremost, you may have heard that it takes a good 2 years minimum to embed anything. And so even if we wanted to embark on a mission to radically reconfigure the history curriculum so that it taught virtually nothing other than histories of the environment, of climate crisis, and so on, we wouldn't be able to teach a single student any of that for 2 years. And that's just because of the way universities work in general. It's not just this university, it's most. They take time, and some of the questions that need to be asked about how one designs course content and how one teaches content to students are big, important questions, and you shouldn't rush past them. But that is a challenge. The other thing is that teaching this in history just straight up looks different than teaching it in other subjects, and that's okay, right? History is a very old academic discipline. I would say that, but it's true. You can go back to Herodotus. I mean, and even in a professional sense, it's been around in universities for more than 200 years, much longer actually. So the version that we do today in modern classrooms, I would argue, is the best ever so far, right? But it doesn't necessarily engage with a topic like sustainability the same way as radiography or film or other topics, or the bench sciences, for instance. So ecological science is going to teach sustainability a completely different way to a historian. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But it is also a challenge because the version of that material that as a course director I might want to privilege and work on is not going to be the same version that shows up in ecology. And so there needs to be space institutionally to do that, to be different and to say, actually, here's another way to do this work. Here's another angle on these problems that we need to consider and teach. And we need to be open to that.
And that's important because that's what leads to, down the line, the possibility for interdisciplinary conversations, both in perhaps an academic problem-based learning context, but also out in actual careers where people have encountered these problems from various different ways, but they all have a common language to encounter these things with. Tell me about how the students respond to some of this content, because with it being so deeply in there, it's not as if this is a particularly one-off profound encounter they would very distinctly respond to or not. Do you see changes in student attitudes around sustainability as a theme as they progress through their studies?
I do. And actually, I've seen a change over the last 10 years of teaching history as well. So the average student now, whether or not they would sort of come out and say it, takes the entire constellation of issues related to the climate crisis and to sustainability extremely seriously. Which is quite understandable. They're going to live through it on average, right? In a way that their parents won't. And so it makes perfect sense. They respond quite well to this sort of distributed framework. It isn't sort of forced upon them, but they can choose it. There's quite a lot of freedom in history modules typically to sort of bend the essay question in the direction you want to go to a certain extent, choose topics out of a menu of available materials. When we teach public history in our second year, one of the options is around climate crisis and curating exhibitions that sort of interrogate the crisis and sort of imagining what those museum exhibitions might look like in the British Museum or any other massive London institution. That's an option our students can do. And many of them will opt for what I would think of as sort of social justice issues, of which sustainability is one. So there's that. Many students will choose to look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement. They will look at questions connected to race and police violence, or even sort of more historical questions like, say, refugees, the Kindertransport, the Second World War. None of these are directly and obviously about sustainability per se, but they gravitate towards what you might describe as social justice issues.
Yeah, taking sustainability and education for sustainable development at its broadest.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's very easy to just focus on green, but in reality, these things encompass so many different social struggles and issues in the world that, yeah, everything you're describing definitely dovetails into that. You've got a lot going on across the history curriculum, but where could it go further? What improvements would you like to see?
Well, I would like to see an explicit history of the environment module. So despite the fact that I've described quite a distributed arena, I guess, or an array of topics, there is enormous value in focusing on something for 12 weeks and diving deep and assessing it. Now, that comes with requirements. You need, I would argue, someone in the room as the teacher, and you need learners who are invested in the topic in a particular way. They opt to do it. They're choosing to be there. They're choosing to invest their time in learning about it to quite a considerable degree. And I wouldn't want that module to start in the recent past. I would want it to start at the very least in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. That would be, to me, the smallest possible time frame to really get a run at this.
Sketch this out for us. It's clear you put some thought in. I'm very curious to see what you've got.
I'm not a modernist, but I think if you want to start talking about kind of questions of global sustainability as a shared social and political issue, you have to start with the Bretton Woods framework and sort of global government, as it were, at least in a westernized sense, as it emerges from the Second World War. Not because those folks are sort of immediately conscious of the implications of everything that's going on in the world in terms of industrial output and carbon emissions, but because the systems and structures we use now to debate these things come from then. There's a direct relationship between kind of UN global climate and sustainability structures and the formation of the UN in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So you got to tell that story. The other reason is because they dropped some atomic bombs, and I cannot think of a single event in the recent past that has had a more obvious environmental impact than nuclear weaponry. So you can start there in a storytelling sense in a way that will take students with you. Also, it fundamentally historicizes the question. We aren't dropping our learners into an environment where they don't know what came before landmark agreements or the first COP summit or whatever. They do. you take a run at that in history. You don't sidle up to whatever the thing is in question and just sort of start addressing it point blank. You have to understand context. Context is king. So, I can't teach that module. I'm not a modernist. I don't know enough about it, but we have various historians who could.
Fantastic. Well, that's a clarion call to any modernists listening to this podcast to give that a go then. But I think it's very interesting what you're describing there, because that's connecting, like you say, global institutions with discussions we have about the Anthropocene, all sorts of things you could connect there. So that sounds really exciting. Do you have any advice for colleagues, whether they're looking at perhaps implementing that you've described specifically, or sustainability more generally across their curriculum? What advice would you give them? What suggestions would you make about how they can go about doing so?
I think only two pieces, really. It's about being succinct. The first is that they don't need to worry about whether or not students take this seriously. They can step past that. I think it's pretty clear that your average university student, indeed the vast majority of them, want to know about this in a rounded way. So they can step past that. And the second piece of advice would be that there's no such thing, I just admitted I couldn't teach that course, but that doesn't mean I can't teach issues of the environment. So there's no time period that's off limits. There's no specialty that it somehow prevents one from teaching histories of the environment, of sustainability, of social justice. Those terms are the terms we use today, but those topics are deeply historical. And so there's no reason not to reach in and do that work. And our modules will benefit, our content will benefit. There's, a range of other things we have to get done, but there is an appropriate balance, I would argue, between setting aside time to address questions of social justice and sustainability, while at the same time pursuing, the more specialist material that we have to cover. So in other words, I suppose it comes down to, I would say, don't be worried about it. Just do it. Pay a bit of time, pay a bit of attention to it, and it'll pay a bit of attention to it. I think we'll stop there. Yeah.
What you're telling us there is something we've heard from other colleagues as well, which is this idea that to sort of hive off sustainability as its own thing actually underplays it, and it makes it seem like it's just an optional extra, when in reality, when you treat it as a theme that's embedded throughout, it's consistently weaved in, there's a time to shine a spotlight on it, but so long as it's always there, the students will slowly respond, develop, and learn around that. Dave, you've given us a really broad view, and I really appreciate that. Are there any things left that you'd like to say, anything you'd like to share with any colleagues who are listening?
Yeah, just that on that final point, very briefly, I would argue strongly in favor of that perspective on sustainability. This isn't an issue that can be disconnected and studied separately, I would argue, from other things, nor should it be collapsed into a kind of mosaic of things and therefore lose importance. We need to pay attention to it. It is clearly an existential set of questions for human beings in the near future. But addressing it solely as, if we were to say it's solely about where my clothing comes from, or solely about, energy usage at the institution or something like that, we would be missing the larger point. It is those things, and it is its connection to matters of global poverty, industrialized or post-industrial capitalism. There are all these other connected, you mentioned the Anthropocene, the idea that human beings have so materially affected the climate of the planet that we have entered literally a sort of new environmental and geological era named after us as a species. You can teach that in geography in a geographical way and be bang on, but that is only a small part of the story. And so actually a robust institutional understanding of these things has to come from multiple disciplines at once, embracing multiple perspectives. That is how an institution like a university can meaningfully contribute to a more sustainable future.
Fantastic. Dave, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. Looking forward to all the work in your Applied Humanities module kicking in next year.
Thanks for having me.
No worries.
My thanks again to Dave Hitchcock for his insights that he shared with us on the Teaching Transformations podcast. Thanks for joining us on the Teaching Transformations podcast. The podcast is a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I've been your host, Jack Swan. Production and video editing is handled by Harry Cooper. The video version of the podcast was recorded by Harry King and Drew Shelley Winfield. Audio design and editing is managed by Matt Crawley. Additional equipment and recording space was organised by James Sanford and Kiara Hewer. Distribution and promotion is organised by Bethany Clemson. Special thanks go to Andrew Lombard and Felicity Brambling-Wells for all their support in helping us put together this Teaching Transformations podcast.